background story of how this Sunday came about. I get a lot of emails and I get a lot of solicitations to get involved with this, that, and stuff. And there was this one that sort of piqued my interest, and it was from our guest speaker. And my admiration is his persistence. It wasn't just one email and then that's it. It was several, and says, here's the openings I have, here's what I've got. And so I took a leap of faith and said, yeah, let's do it on June 5th. That's perfect date for it. It works up. And then as the weeks, and this was back in January, and so as the weeks progressed, I looked and said, oh my gosh, Santa Cruz Pride Parade is going to be in person this year after 2 years being off. And so we've marched in that for the entire 40 years or 40 plus years of its existence, this church has. So I sent back saying, can we switch it? And Kalen was very good about it, switch it. And so all of a sudden it came. But what I'd like to highlight here is that I don't know Kalen very much except by email and stuff and reputation, but he has exhibited in coming here today all the behaviors of a kind person: perseverance, patience, adaptability, and remaining courteous and calm during the tumultuous time of bringing him here. So I just want to say that those are values that we as a denomination totally respect. Reverend Kalen has been a United Methodist minister for more than 40 years and is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Christian Fellowship. He traveled the country with it full-time with his wife, Darlene, who's with us here today, from 2003 to 2006, accepting invitations to speak at churches, proclaiming the hopeful message of universalism. Following that, he served in churches in Iowa, half-time, while spending half the time on the road. He retired from parish ministry in 2013, but continues to travel the country speaking on universalism. Over the years, he has spoken at more than 240 Unitarian Universalist churches. Kalen has written a book on universalism entitled Destined for Salvation, and a study book that goes with it for the same title. His books and CDs and DVDs will be available for sale after the service for purchase, and I'll make an offer. Any of you on Zoom that are interested, maybe you can put it in the chat, and one of us can, if you want to buy something, let us know, and we'll pick up from the 43 computers on there. So I would like all of you to please give a real strong Unitarian Universalist Fellowship welcome to Kalen Fritad.
It is indeed a great privilege to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation, Russ. I love speaking, excuse me. Boy. I love UU churches. I've spoken, as Russ said, at more than 240 UU churches across the country. I've spoken at churches in all 48 contiguous states, and so we get around. And we're from Iowa, and so I would guess we probably are the ones who traveled the furthest to come to church today. About almost 2,000 miles, and we have our travel trailer. And we'll be here in California through the end of June, where I'll be speaking, I guess, at a total of 5 UU churches in California this year. I've spoken multiple times before in California, so I love California as well. And so it's really really wonderful to be here today with all of you. When I served the United Methodist Church in Dallas Center, Iowa, I became acquainted with the UU minister in Des Moines. And when she realized that I believed in universalism, she invited me to attend a special service that their church was going to be having. It's going to be in the small town of Mitchellville, which is a few miles east of Des Moines. And it was going to be in a church building that originally housed a Universalist congregation. There was not a congregation there anymore at that time, but they had the tradition in that church in Des Moines to have one service each summer at that Universalist church as a way of celebrating their Universalist heritage. So I was happy to accept her invitation to join them for that service. And I'll always remember when I walked up the walk in front of that church, over the door it read Universalist Church. And I thought, I have arrived at home. Universalism has been really important to me for a long time, and that's why I wrote a book on the subject, and that's why we travel around speaking at churches on Universalism, and have done it for many years. Today I'm going to be speaking on the history and the significance of the teaching of Universalism. It is sometimes referred to as universal salvation, so I'd like to offer a definition of salvation that's different probably from what you've heard from other sources. You're probably aware that, at least among more conservative Christian churches, their definition of salvation is, or would likely be something like this: to accept Jesus as your personal savior so you can go to heaven when you die. Well, that definition obviously works for many, many people, but at the same time, it seems that's not a very adequate understanding of salvation because it doesn't necessarily involve any change or growth. So a definition that I've come up with for salvation is that it's to learn and grow either with or without divine influence so as to experience fullness of life in this life and beyond. And if you don't believe in the divine, or if you don't believe in life after death, then you can just leave those parts off the definition. So to me, the most basic understanding of salvation is to learn and grow so as to experience fullness of life. And so I believe, I reject the teaching that many people espouse, and that is that some people are going to spend eternity suffering in hell. And I believe that everyone will eventually experience salvation or fullness of life. And for certain individuals, if that doesn't take place in this lifetime, I believe it will take place sometime beyond. During the time of Jesus, the conventional thinking of the day, at least for most people, was that the vast majority of people would spend eternity suffering in hell. Well, that wasn't a unanimous view by any means. There were the Zoroastrians, and you may know that the Zoroastrian faith was developed in the area of Persia, which is where the current country of Iran is. And that was developed in the 5th and the 6th centuries before the time of Jesus. And so they were Universalists. Isn't that wonderful? I think that is, and so this Universalist idea is not a new idea. It's been around for at least 2,500 years, and I'm sure it's going to be around for a long time yet to come. In addition to the Zoroastrians, Jesus also, I believe, did not teach eternal damnation. There are many, many passages in the Bible that teach universalism. And so Jesus went against the conventional thinking of his day in teaching that ultimately everyone would be saved or would experience fullness of life. In the environment, though, where the conventional thinking was that probably the vast majority of people would spend eternity suffering in hell, it was sometimes difficult to convince people otherwise. And so there were some people who were converted to Christianity. They professed to be followers of Jesus, but they held on to this belief of the endless suffering of many people beyond death. But there were a lot of the early Christians who did believe in universalism. In fact, it seems that it was the vast majority of the early Christians who did believe in universalism. Some of the early followers of Jesus who taught universalism would have been Origen and Clement of Alexandria, two major theologians in the church. Others included Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and many, many others as well. As I said, though, there were some people who weren't fully converted to Christianity. They professed to be followers of Jesus, but at the same time held on to the belief of the endless suffering of many people beyond death. Tertullian was a theologian, early church leader, but he was one who wasn't fully converted. He became a Christian at age 40, and he held on to his belief of the endless suffering of many people beyond death. In fact, he so relished the idea of other people. Of course, it's always other people, never himself. He so relished the idea of other people, so many other people suffering forever in hell, that he said he believed that one of the best things about heaven would be the superb view of the damned frying in hell. Now, doesn't the thought of that just make you feel good all over? Just think about that. A person who professed to be a follower of Jesus, a follower of the one who taught so much about love and peace and forgiveness and grace and mercy and so on, could so relish the idea of so many people suffering excruciating torment in hell forever. The theologian Augustine was another person who wasn't fully converted to Christianity. He became a Christian at age 32, and he also held on to his belief of the endless suffering of many people beyond death. Now, Augustine was a pretty decent theologian in many respects, and therefore it's not surprising that his theology started to become dominant in the church. Augustine lived in the latter part of the 4th century and into the 5th century. So it's not surprising that by the 6th century, the teaching of universalism came to be quite a controversial issue. In order to resolve this issue, the Roman Emperor Justinian called a church meeting. It was the 5th General Council in the year 553. Now, does it seem a little strange to you that a Roman emperor would call a church meeting? Well, it makes perfect sense when you think about the fact that emperors like to control people. Isn't that a given? Emperors like to control people, and the people back then, as today, had learned that threatening people with eternal damnation was a foolproof means of controlling them. Now that probably sounds familiar to you. There are a lot of churches yet today that use that technique in order to control their people. You see, if you can convince people that there's a possibility of spending eternity in hell, then you've got them where you want them. You can get them to do anything you want by threatening them with eternal damnation. But the problem is, they were having trouble controlling those free-spirited universalists, you see. They could threaten them with unending hell all they wanted, and they didn't take it seriously. So out of frustration, the emperor allied himself with the hellraisers of the day, the people who advocated the teaching of unending suffering of people beyond death. The emperor allied himself with the hellraisers, and together they pushed through a resolution which abolished the teaching of universalism. Now, it's not surprising that with all of the power of the church and the state against the teaching of universalism, that teaching pretty well died out or went dormant after that. And that lasted for a long time, really for about 1,000 years. But you can't suppress the truth indefinitely, right? Eventually the truth will start bubbling up someplace. And that's what happened about 300 years ago. It really started more than 300 years ago, but it was about 300 years ago that the teaching of universalism started to become a strong teaching once again. John Wesley, who was the primary or the most significant organizer and leader of the Methodist movement back in the 18th century, he had a close association with a group of Christians called the Moravians. Now, the Moravians believed in universalism. Isn't that wonderful? Another group of universalists before there were universalists, if you will. In other words, before the Universalist Church in America was organized. Anyway, in those early years, Wesley did not believe in universalism or universal salvation. He disagreed with those Moravians, and he argued strenuously against them, but it seems that he did not prevail. Instead, they wore him down, and eventually Wesley, late in life, came to believe in universalism. Now, I love to tell United Methodists that John Wesley eventually came to believe in universalism, and that is because in the United Methodist Church, the most conservative people are the ones who are most likely to reject the teaching of universalism. At the same time, they can often be heard to say, and I say, yeah, let's do that. After all, he eventually came to believe in universalism. The American colonies proved to be okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. The American colonies proved to be a particularly fertile ground for the spread of the teaching. It was George de Benneville came over from France in 1741, and he did quite a bit in spreading the teaching of Universalism in eastern Pennsylvania and in New Jersey and in Maryland. John Murray came over from England in 1770 in spreading the teaching of Universalism throughout the American colonies. Excuse me. Sure.
Make sure this is.
It was under Murray's leadership that the Universalist Church in America was formed. There were, surprisingly, during the time of the early church, there were many women leaders. The Apostle Paul mentions many women leaders in the church, and so there were women leaders at a time when women's liberation was not even a thought in the minds of most people. But that also was true in the modern Universalist church. There were many women leaders, and one of those leaders was Olympia Brown. Olympia Brown was the first woman to be ordained in any denomination, and when she was ordained in the Universalist Church in 1863. Now, we United Methodists started ordaining women in 1956. And you know, I felt pretty good about that for a long time, because there are many churches that still don't ordain women. That is, I felt good about the fact that we started ordaining women in 1956, until I realized that the Universalists beat us by almost 100 years when they ordained Olympia Brown in 1863. Hosea Ballou was the most prominent leader in the Universalist Church during his life and ministry. And when he died, there's a little bit of a dispute regarding how many there were, but of the Universalists. But when he died in 1852, my understanding is there could have been close to 800,000 Universalists in the Universalist Church in America. And so it was a strong movement, to be sure. The teaching of Universalism hasn't been espoused only by Universalists or Unitarians, for that matter, but has been espoused by other leaders and theologians of other denominations as well. For example, back in the 19th century, there was a German theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher. I wonder how many people here have heard of old Friedrich? Anybody here heard of Friedrich? That's not unusual, because Friedrich was a theologian, but he was a fine theologian and a strong advocate of universalism. And besides that, I just like to say his name. Friedrich Schleiermacher. I love that name. I think it is so cool. Anyway, there were other leaders, theologians in the 20th century who taught universalism, including
Okay.
Okay, all right. Okay. It seems to me that the teaching of a God of eternal damnation has prevailed for far too long in most churches and in our society at large, and with devastating consequences. And that's why it is such an important issue for me. One of the reasons this is so important to me is because the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. people know that they would never ever punish their own children without end. I mean, it is absurd. In fact, it is literally an insane concept to punish people without end, right? Because we know what happens to people when they punish people or torture people excessively. They end up either in prison or a mental hospital. Yet people believe that God will do that for eternity. I mean, it is literally an insane concept to believe that God will do that for eternity, to torture people forever because they were naughty. And so the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God, and sometimes they become atheists. Now, I need to acknowledge that I've learned a lot about atheism from UUs. And I'm grateful. When we first went on the road 19 years ago, it's been 19 years. It's amazing that we've had the privilege of being on the road either full-time or half-time for most of that time. And anyway, so I've learned a lot about atheism from UUs. When we went on the road, I knew a little bit, but I didn't know much. And one of the high points of my speaking in UU churches is that I've met a lot of wonderful atheists. And now I've met a lot of wonderful people of a great variety of faiths. You see, there are some people who find atheism to be a thoughtful, responsible, mature way to approach life, and it works for them. For people for whom atheism works, I really don't have a difficulty with that. In other denominations, though, when people become atheists, that sometimes is not such a positive thing. And that is because they sometimes still have in the back of their mind the possibility of spending eternity in hell. And if there's no God to rescue them from that plight, then they sometimes conclude that they are doomed, and that can lead to despair and meaninglessness. There are many, many churches where a lot of their members attend only at Christmas and Easter, and there's a good reason for that. And that is because at Christmas and Easter, those 2 times of celebration, there's little danger that anybody's going to talk about a God of eternal damnation. So it's not because they're too lazy to go to church except on Christmas and Easter. It's out of self-preservation. They've heard more damnation teaching than they ever want to hear about, and they're not going to put up with it anymore. And so they stay away from church except Christmas and Easter, those 2 times of celebration when it's very unlikely anybody's going to talk about a God of eternal damnation. Then there's perhaps half of the population that don't go to church even at Christmas and Easter. And I've talked with an awful lot of unchurched people, and they so often bring up the idea of unending suffering of people that it obviously is an issue that weighs heavily upon them. And so they seem to hope that somebody will make a rebuttal against that, to tell them that it ain't so, that that's not what God is like, and that's not what is going to happen. And so they seem to instinctively reject the idea of a monster God who tortures people forever because they were naughty, or a very weak and an uncaring God who allows people of their own free will to somehow mess up and find themselves experiencing hell in the next life, and then just to abandon them there. So what kind of a God is that? A monster God who tortures people forever, or a weak and an uncaring God who either doesn't want to save everybody or who is unable to save everybody? And so there are many of these unchurched people, these disillusioned people that aren't aware that there are churches that teach love instead of judgment, that teach hope instead of damnation. And so they drop out of church altogether. We all want to make the world a better place. And that is what motivates me more than anything else to travel around the country speaking on universalism. We all want to make the world a better place, but it seems to me that we're not going to have very much success in that regard as long as the teaching of a God of eternal damnation continues to prevail in most churches and in our society at large. That is because people's perception of God has a powerful and direct influence on how they live their lives. If people believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel, it's very, very easy to justify living that same way ourselves. It's like the old song, One Tin Soldier goes, "Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. Do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end." Sadly, I see people in our own country and around the world seeking to justify evil behavior in the name of heaven, in the name of God. And it's much easier to do that if we believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel. On the other hand, if we believe that God is loving and kind and merciful and gracious and patient and so on, we're much more likely to live according to those values ourselves. This is of enormous significance. I believe that if we are to change the world for the better, perhaps the most important single thing that we need to do is to change people's perception of God. That is because it's very difficult to raise people's behavior above their perception of God. Because as a man named Robert Short, who wrote a book called Something to Believe in, he says, people tend to resemble the gods they serve. And I think that is powerful and profound. People tend to resemble the gods they serve. So what we need to do is to raise people's perception of God from that of being judgmental and cruel to that of loving. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was sometimes criticized because he loved his enemies too much. He was told, "You shouldn't love your enemies, you should seek to destroy them." To which he replied, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Isn't that powerful? Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? Abraham Lincoln was a Universalist. He rejected the teaching of a God of eternal damnation. He believed in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual, and that everyone would eventually be saved. And because of that, he could love even his enemies. It seems to me that we who believe in universalism, who believe in that power of love and the preciousness of each individual, are called to rise up and to no longer be influenced by negative thoughts, but be able to transform the world through our love. So we who believe in universalism have a powerful and a really important message to share with the world, and it's really important that we do so. Again, Robert Short, in his book called Something to Believe in, he says, there is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies. And then he goes on to say, therefore, our witness should be just as aggressive and unambiguous as theirs has been to us. Fundamentalists can be intimidating, can't they? They go around quoting scripture and asking people whether or not they're saved, so they can be intimidating. But I say, let's not be intimidated by them. After all, we are the ones with the good news. They instead espouse a teaching that is divisive and leads to inhumane behavior and justifies abuse. With their understanding of things, it is really no big deal to torture people, whether it's at Guantanamo Bay or wherever. After all, they believe that God will torture people forever. And if it's okay for God to torture people, surely it must be okay for us to do it. Besides, the torture that we might inflict upon others is nothing compared to the torture that they say that God will inflict upon people forever in a literal lake of fire, no less. So we who believe in universalism, who believe in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual, have a wonderful and important message to share with the world, and it is important that we do so. The teaching of a God of eternal damnation leads to wars and racism and oppression and abuse. In contrast, the spread of the teaching of universalism leads to equality, respect, love, and dignity for all. So I say, let's not be intimidated. Instead, let us freely and boldly proclaim to the world the wonderful message of universalism, and the world will be infinitely better off because of it. Amen. Amen.